welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter and I'll be your host for today's show. So glad you guys are able to join us today. This is such a good time for you just to enjoy seeing what your Gifts to State Policy Network are making possible in this country as we speak. For those of you who've been with us the last few weeks, you've joined us for a three-part series about young people. We heard from our friends at FEE and the Washington Policy Center about how so many worldviews are being created during this time of disruption for folks in their early 20s and early 30s. The great work that they are doing is ensuring that the view of liberty is still going to be the underlying factor for a lot of these young people today. Last week, we had a lively conversation about this disruption in K-12 education. And for those of you who have put a great deal of money and investments in transforming our education system, the moral of that story was, now is our time. We never ever could have forecasted a disruption for a time like this. Today, we're going to close this three-part series with a look at higher ed. When I talk with you guys about higher education, or when I have over the years, the bottom line has been tuition is rising, inflation is rising, and oftentimes the value of education is decreasing. We all know that that bubble was going to burst at some point. I don't know that we knew it would happen so quickly. Seems like we are right on the edge of that happening now. Now here's the good news, because I promised you guys the show is all about good news. The good news is we are in a time of disruption where there is room for innovation to rethink higher education. Today, we are going to be joined by Jim Sturgis, the CEO of Pioneer in Massachusetts, and Debbie Fowler, the Senior Vice President for Student Success at Western Governors University, to dig into this very issue. But first, let's check in with Tracy Sharp over in Berkeley, California, where there's a lot of higher ed buzz going around. Tracy, you've got a son who's in college. How's this been impacting him?
It's true. My son is finishing his last semester to get his college degree. And he's hanging in there. It'll be all online. But the fact is, you don't have to have kids or grandkids in college to sense that an education revolution is really starting to play out. Here in San Francisco, in this area, in the Bay Area, higher ed drives big chunks of the local economy, whether that is thousands employed or enrolled at Stanford or Berkeley, to all the state schools and community colleges. This is going to be a fascinating episode today, because right in front of our eyes, we're seeing an old system start to crack. How the lack of market incentives in an already antiquated top-down system like higher ed exposes many of the reasons why it can be a poor return on investment for many students. But that is also vulnerable to disruption. We're fortunate to have these two leaders on the show today to help the broader network make sense of all this and seize the opportunities ahead. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. Well, with that, let's get started. And let's talk with Jim Sturgis. Again, he's the CEO of the Pioneer Institute in Massachusetts. The other point I want to make about Jim is that he serves on the board of overseers at Boston University. So Jim is on the front lines of this in his role there as well. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Well, I'm so glad you're here. You know, we've talked a little bit about the cost of tuition and the value of education. Another thing that I know is a point that gets people pretty fired up is the fact that when you go to college these days, you're not often exposed to a view of freedom, liberty, or free markets for that matter. A lot of the professors, frankly, lean left, and that's the worldview that they put towards their students. So let's ask a question and get right to that. Is this time of disruption so big that the window is open to change that over time as well?
The window is open. The window is open. I have my younger daughter is just going to college, and my older daughter has just completed college. And I think as much as ideological diversity is important, they are also hampered by just silence. They don't want to talk about things because there aren't safe spaces, if you will, to actually have open debate. And that's been a huge thing. And, you know, that's a function of many things. You know, it's everything from conformity to the ideological bent of folks who are actually making hiring decisions. One thing that people often forget about all this is that it has a lot to do with a residential school. right? If you have a school that's not a residential school, the fact is you have to go back to mom and dad, or if you go back to real life, or you're in a work study. And so you get a dose of real life and it exposes you to other viewpoints. So it counteracts a lot of that. I think there are two things going on here. One is hopeful, one's less hopeful.
Okay.
The hopeful one is, look, the rush to online courses is going to mean that there are fewer institutional hooks into students. And I think we could actually weaken some of the ideological pressures, especially the grasp on faculty hiring. And that is really the node of everything, right? On the downside is, don't think that enforcers of ideological purity at the administrative level will give up on this. And that if they have online courses that are recorded, they will certainly seek to align whatever's in those online courses that they can actually view whenever they want with what they want to see at the university. So it could cut both ways.
Okay, so there's definitely more work that needs to be done in that area. And frankly, before we can even get there, it seems like we've got to help navigate the mess that we're in. Just this morning, I saw Notre Dame has gone online. University of North Carolina also had students come to school for about a week and then said, oh, now it's virtual. So let's talk about Massachusetts. I think that's pretty much the hotbed of higher ed in this country. You're right in the middle of it. What trends are you seeing happening now on the ground in Massachusetts?
Rebecca, we're a hotbed of lots of stuff, some of it nefarious. So look, a baseline fact, 75% of students in the United States attend public institutions of higher education, right? Massachusetts is oddly the reverse. 63% of our students attend private institutions. And I'm a great believer that the private institutions is where all the innovation is going to happen. We've seen all the public institutions here close up their tents and say, we're going to just do online, that's it. It's the safest way for us to proceed. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is, look, over the past few years in Massachusetts, even prior to COVID, we had failure after failure, many mergers. Boston University ate up Wheelock College. Boston College just ate up Pine Manor. It goes on and on. There have been just some failures as well. 5 in just the last year and a half. So there are already cost structure issues. And the fact is, for small residential schools that are dependent on tuitions, that discount their tuitions to get their students in there who have no endowment, they're in a real tough spot already. So I think one of the things that we're looking at here is the merger and the flexibility of new institutions, and then this thing called COVID hits, and all disruption leads to innovation, especially in the private market.
So you mentioned the public universities not being able to innovate. Have people, the governor, for instance, come out in support and with new innovative ideas, or is there any leadership on that end?
No, not really. I mean, I hate to say it because the governor is actually a former Pioneer alum. So, we'd love to say that that was the case, but that is not the case. I think what's happened there is what has happened around the country in K-12. They've just kind of run for the hinterlands and said, no risk, we don't want to deal with that. What I would say on that is, when we see that Harvard has 40% of its students coming to campus, just the freshmen and the seniors, they're really allowing in. People look at that and say, well, is that going to tell us something about the broader market? No. Is MIT going to tell us something about the broader market? No. What I'd say to folks is this: the innovation will happen from top 100 privates, I think. It'll also happen among second tier, and it'll happen with new market entrants. The folks like the Harvards and the MITs live in a world onto their own. They don't, they can do whatever they want. They'll still be there. What I do think that's really interesting is to watch how, say, Boston University, Boston College, Tufts, Northeastern here are handling this. And it is amazing. I don't often say that about these universities. I have lots of complaints. However, students in student pods, testing in the thousands, creating behavioral codes and actually having them sign things that say we will behave in a certain way to make sure we're taking care of other folks. There's some good stuff about that. I can see there's some potential downsides about that. We can talk about that later. But they are truly the innovators in the space. And what I'd say is, just to give you a sense as to the differential in leadership between these private institutions and our public political leaders. Yes. One of these universities itself is going to be testing up to 12,000 residents, students, faculty members a day. In Massachusetts itself, a campus, if you will, of 6.9 million residents is testing currently. Yesterday, I checked the numbers, 13,500. So, there's just when your existence is at risk, you work your head off to make sure you can continue to do your work, right? That's what private markets do.
Yeah. Well, so you're talking about the existence being at risk. I know you're in a lot of conversations with other folks on board of overseers and in the higher ed community. It seems like liability of reopening, whether you're public or private, is still going to be a heavy weight. What are those conversations like, and how deep of a worry is it?
Yeah, so that's where sort of the, if you will, the signing statements about your recognition that there is risk. It's actually making people be responsible for their decisions, saying, there are risks. We live in a world of risks, and we're going to do this, and this, all these incredible things. I mean, one of the universities has isolation beds for 400 students. They're able to identify, they think, students within 3 hours, whether they've actually infected other. I mean, they've done really terrific work bringing in scientists and, the way you would really want government to work. They would love to have liability shields. We're not going to see that happen. Not in Massachusetts. There was some talk of it in Connecticut, some talk in a couple other states, but I think that's true. We see that also at the federal level with conversations in Congress. So I think what you're going to see is just a lot of innovation to make sure that we can actually keep these schools going. And that's where most of the conversation is. I would say the second piece of the conversation is for those institutions that can allow themselves to do this, they're thinking about who may be failing, who may need a merger, and how do we take advantage of that.
Okay, so Jim, your organization has done a lot on K-12. You guys are a leader in that area, and you're not just sitting on the sidelines watching all this play out in higher ed. Can you tell us more specifically some of the activity that Pioneer is engaged in to help make sure all of this goes in the right direction?
Sure. Well, I always walk around with a hat in hand. It's why not? It's on my head. Asking for money to do more. But let me share a couple of things that we've done over the last year and a half on this issue. And I might just stipulate by saying this. There's a lot of folks are saying, oh my God, they're going to be failures all over the place. There are people who are trying to create businesses like EY, Parthenon, and Admit, two companies that are trying to do this. And they'll tell you that 40, 50% of the institutions will fail. I don't believe that's at all true. I think they'll have 10 to 20%. And I think that you'll see another 10 to 20% engage in a variety of different marriages and innovations. What we've done over the past year is try to facilitate some of that. So one is that our governor, decided that he would try to have one of the public agencies actually force the closure of private institutions. I would repeat that because it's too horrible to say. I find it really so wrong-headed. We were shocked when we saw the proposal. They wanted to do at-risk analyses to see who was in financial risk, and then say, we, the public, using the agencies that is its mission is to promote public colleges, have them make determinations around private colleges. Well, we fought that. We won that battle. We're very, very pleased with that. But we decided we didn't want to just stop there. What we wanted to do was, with 16 Boston colleges, including MIT, Boston University, Boston College, and others, we stood up a consortium to support those institutions that we believe were at risk, helping to train some of their financial folks, and also who's going to be on your board to make sure you can meet your fiduciary responsibilities. Now, this may sound familiar to all of you who are familiar with SPN, because that's precisely what SPN does for organizations like mine, which is you do lots of peer-to-peer coaching to make sure you're getting people to up their game. And I can tell you that it's accrued a lot of benefit to us, but I would also say to the entire movement. So that's what we've tried to do, and I think it's been successful thus far. With COVID, all bets are off. We'll see what this is the world that we're in.
So would you say that this will fundamentally change a student's experience, 3 years from now? My niece, for example, was supposed to go to college. She deferred. She wasn't going to be victim to the old bait and switch that some of these other kids are experiencing now. But is there any room for her to have that traditional experience, or is there going to be blended learning moving forward?
It's really interesting. This is where I'm especially excited by. I mean, there are lots of great people, and you're going to hear from one in just a second, but there are lots of great institutions, Southern New Hampshire University, ASU, and others who do some fantastic work in the sort of digital space. I'm especially interested about what happens to the old campuses if they do fail or they need a merger. And I think there are a couple of different ways to think that through. One is that you could envision a variety of different vendors, if you will, whether it's ASU, Southern New Hampshire, Western Governors, Harvard, MIT, offer at campuses that have been closed for their traditional school, but repurposed so kids could have a blended experience of some online, but also some on-campus learning with the support of some professors there. I think that's something that's really interesting and developing. There's also something called the McMaster's program at MIT, which has students come on, do a semester of learning online, and they come on campus for all the networking and all that sort of thing. So that's going to lower costs dramatically, and frankly, I think it may lead to at least as good of an outcome in terms of the product, and maybe even better.
So ultimately, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. Costs of college should be going down, and the value of the education should be going up.
Oh, absolutely. And I think there are absolutely good ways to do that, and we have them in front of us. We've known what they are for a long time, but you have to go through disruptions. Nobody likes that, but you have to go through that.
All right, Jim. Thank you. We're going to hear back from Jim again in just a few minutes. Please remember as we chat to put questions for Jim or any of our guests in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And now we will welcome Debbie Fowler to the show. Unless Tracy, you've got something to add. I saw your microphone go off. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna thank Jim. He's been a tremendous resource for the rest of the network in higher ed. A great, because he has so much experience and he's working with the leaders in higher ed. It really helps the broader network to have him share his knowledge. So,
thank you. Agreed. All right, we're going to welcome Debbie Fowler to the show. Debbie, again, is the Senior Vice President of Student Success at Western Governors University. Western Governors University, you know, as Jim mentioned, has a wonderful online learning model that others are copying and amending for their own uses right now during this time of disruption. But Debbie, for those who don't know about Western Governors University, could you first just share a little bit of background about the university, how it got started, and what exactly you guys do?
I'd love to. It's great to be here with you and your listeners. Thanks for letting me share. So WGU was actually the brainchild of the Commission of Western Governors, hence the name, back in 1997. And they were trying to solve a very specific problem: increase access to high quality higher education. Simple as that, right? And there was this little thing called the internet that was burgeoning about that time. And could they use that as a tool? It wasn't about going online. It was about how to solve that problem. Turns out that the internet was the perfect solution to address those three big problems that we saw where students were not being served by higher ed, and that was flexibility, affordability, and a personalized individual university experience. Brought all that together, and it turned out to be even more popular than we could have ever dreamed. We've now got over 120,000 active students, an alumni base of 195,000. Not bad in 20 years.
Wow, and here you are in the middle of a pandemic, and I'm assuming that you guys aren't just sending kids Zoom links, that you actually have a platform that is working well and you know what you're doing in that virtual space.
We do know what we're doing, that's right. And so it turns out the same things that solve those problems work in a pandemic. Who knew?
Your enrollment has not gone down in the last few months.
We have really been grateful to have a continued increase over the last 5 years, 15 to 20% every year, and we still have students coming. The look for the fall is pretty strong.
Great. Now, one thing about Western Governors University is that you guys recognized that tuition was too expensive and the quality of education was lacking, but you didn't stop there. You guys aren't just coming up with lesson plans that you think feel good and sound good. Tell us how you guys come up with curriculum for your students.
That's right. So we really want to start with the end in mind. So what do employers need their graduates to be able to do? And so from talking to employers individually, employer partnerships, through councils, through all sorts of research, we're identifying the competencies and the skills and then building the learning from that. And most particularly the assessments. So the assessments are the things that grads in that field would do when they get out to the real world. And so that is the assessment of competency. And you've heard many people speak about competency-based education. That's what the WGU model is. So it doesn't matter whether our students have developed these competencies out in the workforce and are coming back to finish their college education, or whether they're learning it with us. We serve all types of learners and just believe in that inherent value of any student to achieve their goals, and we're there to do that.
Well, it sounds like any higher ed institution that is still kind of chasing their tail right now, unable to pivot during this time of disruption, could learn a lot from you guys, even if they're not ready to go virtual all the time. Have you guys been involved in any kind of, Jim mentioned some peer groups, any situations where you're helping to guide other higher ed institutions on how they can improve right now and learn from you?
Absolutely. And that's really been kind of our motto, that it's a problem that is too big for any one institution or body to solve. We really enjoy collaborating with others. And so from webinars to what an institution could do on their own to partnering specifically with a solution for a particular institution, we've kind of run the gamut. And that just really builds on the relationships we've had with community colleges all along, because we've always been sort of that finishing route and partnered with them. And so we're building on that to help meet the need for individual students and for institutions of borrowing, whether that's courses or continuation paths, whatever that might be.
Good. Now, Debbie, you heard me start the show by asking Jim a question about the philosophy of some of the professors and how that becomes ingrained in the curriculum. And I always wonder, I picture university, at least in my experience, I got on campus and I would walk around and I would just embrace all these different views and I wanted everything just thrown at me. And we heard actually from our friend at Washington Policy Center just 2 weeks ago that I think he said it was about 83% of college students they surveyed had never heard of free market ideas. So I wonder, if you're in an online university, is that an issue, or do you feel like it's a more balanced approach?
We have such a wide variety of students and of faculty because of the distributed model. You know, it was Western governors, but now it's coast to coast and military serving overseas as well. And so our course instructors, our program mentors, who are the lifeblood of our university, are across the nation, working from home offices from the very beginning, not just in COVID, serving students. So that brings a whole new diversity of opinion. And our student population is from teenager to mid-80s and beyond. We announce that the age range at every commencement, and it's always fun to hear. And there's a big roar as you hear, you know, somebody who's 85 has graduated with their degree. But what that means is that our students are, you know, not only generationally, but from experiences, just meeting all sorts of folks in the communities. We have synchronous and asynchronous activities, of course, and so it's just really a beauty of diversity.
Well, I would imagine that most 85-year-old graduates aren't going to let the young folks get away without hearing some good stories that will set them on the right path for life. So that is great to hear. Ed Johnson just sent in a question for you, Debbie. Can you give us an example of some of the categories of education that WGU provides? And are you guys providing associate and four-year degrees? How does that work? So
we're focused on bachelor's and master's traditionally, but we've now since expanded to the non-degree offerings. So a marketplace of courses, micro-credentials. We've focused in 4 areas: teachers, IT, health professions, and College of Business.
Good. All right, Debbie. Well, thank you. At this point, we will turn it over for more Q&A and bring Jim back because we have a couple of questions for all of our guests.
Great.
And Tracy, did you have any closing comments? I saw your microphone come up.
Marveling at how Western governors has just responded to the market. And I love how Debbie was saying they've built in flexibility and the ability to customize. That just is really meeting a market demand from parents and students. So it's a lot we can learn from this.
Agreed. Okay, guys. Ed Johnson gave us a couple other questions to get us kicked off. First, I love this question, Ed. Thank you so much for asking it. Debbie and Jim, How can federal spending for a higher education be reduced? Jim, we'll start with you and then we'll go over to Debbie.
I mean, I think there are three different ways to think that one through. And one is obviously we've had administrative bloat for quite some time, and that's going to get winnowed out because of the competition and the pressures from COVID and also from the disruptions that are resulting from COVID. So I think that's an absolutely, we have the same issue in K-12 where administrative hires now far outnumber the number of teachers in the classrooms. We have that same thing at the higher ed level. The second thing is, I mentioned the residential model as somewhat problematic in terms of ideology, but I also think it's pretty problematic from the perspective of cost. Think about Europe. One of the reasons why European universities are funded by European governments and they're able to do it at a lower clip than we do is that they're not residential models for the most part. There are some, but for the most part, they're not. And I think we're going to see the college experience probably change over the next 20 years in that regard, unless we decide to do much more blending. And the last thing is I just say, look, there are some great folks, Mitch Daniels at Purdue, who has the Backer-Boiler program around income sharing agreements. And there's also sort of there are ancillary benefits that come from that in the sense that they're pointing you toward an actual career, an actual job. They have a vested interest in making sure you're successful. So it's a little bit like what Debbie was saying a second ago, that you kind of start with the competencies you have to have, and then you create the coursework from that. A lot of universities have moved away from that. So,
yeah, Debbie, anything to add?
Sure. We can speak to what we've been doing, and that a big part of lowering that federal government cost is just lowering the cost and being laser focused on what you're paying for. To Jim's point, what is it? And if you're really after student outcomes, student success, then does every dollar you're spending really feed into that? And at Western Governors, we see it as if we're spending the students' money, and would they want that dollar spent for that? And then being really clear in helping the student to borrow what makes sense. We started an initiative several years ago, and I kid our vice president who started it because he got some awards for really essentially developing a calculator. And it helps the student calculate what do they really need instead of taking that number from FAFSA and borrowing it all. And consequently, we run over 10 percentage points, 57% of our students borrow compared to national average of 69%. And even those who do borrow, our students are borrowing about half the national average. And so it's two ways that at least we're trying to solve that problem.
Wow, what a relief. That's one thing I haven't mentioned yet was the student debt that they end up with these days. It's just so out of control. So that's amazing. Thank you. Follow-up question from Ed, and I'm not sure if you guys will have the answer for this one, but we talked last week about K-12 education, and ideally the dollars should follow the child. It just seems to make sense. Is there any room for that in higher ed?
So I'll dive into this one because you didn't pick one of us to come up with an answer that's well, Ed, you can choose. You can decide how good it is. Look, I mean, it is the holy grail in the K-12 space, and it is truly the holy grail on the higher ed side. And one could imagine to some degree a scholarship program that could be created that would allow for that. Oddly enough, we don't have the same kind of strictures on public funds for religiously affiliated schools in the higher ed space that we do in the K-12 space. So I would think there's much more room to make that happen on the higher ed space. But I would say, Ed, that that's a very difficult one. That's why it's the holy grail. It's very difficult to get there.
Makes sense. Anything to add, Tracy or Debbie?
I will defer to, I like Jim's points.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Last question, and this one is from Ross Emmett. Ross, thanks for joining the show today. Ross actually sent me a statement from the ASU president, President Crow. And it's a rather long statement, so I'm going to do my best to summarize it for you guys. But basically, President Crow's statement is saying that underlying our COVID-19 management framework is the assumption that the COVID-19 pandemic will not be over or substantially mitigated by vaccines, treatments, and other public health measures for the foreseeable future. We cannot just wait out COVID-19 as if there is no reasonable basis on which to believe it will be fully conquered anytime in the near future. The recognition of that fact calls for the implementation of a plan that ensures we have built a model for the advancement and operation of ASU in a balanced and sustainable manner well into the future. Ross wants to know what we think about that statement. Debbie, we'll start with you.
I think anyone who believes that we're going to be back to that normal of a year ago, yeah, it's not going to happen. We're going to have to adjust to a new normal. And I think what we found is there's so many things, some things that we knew were probably a good idea to try, but they were just too hard to try. And that's coming from a university that is only 20 years young, right? And innovates. Imagine that in the space of universities that have been around 100 years. And then there are things that we never would have thought of, but in trying to solve the problem of COVID, this has been a reset that has produced just some incredible innovations. And I think embracing that and for the new normal is really what that comes to. And we don't even know what the new normal will be. What we know is it's going to produce, you know, I say to my team, you get diamonds from a lot of pressure, and we've had a lot of pressure. We're just going to come out with a lot of diamonds.
Good. Jim, anything to add? How do you respond to that?
You know, I'm just an eternal optimist. That's why I do what I do. I actually think we're going to come up with a vaccine or two or three that are going to work quite well. The question, the problem with, even if that happens, is the following. We already had universities that were deeply troubled. They were bloated and were starting to fail or run into some real problems. The student debt issue you just mentioned is another big one, right? So you got that. You've got that. This is a huge disruption that's sort of an accelerant on a fire. And so the folks who are able to be first movers really are important here because they're going to get a competitive advantage. And I guess the reason I think that's really important is those institutions that can prove they have cultures that can change and adapt are winners, and the ones that don't, they're going to slide into sort of third tier. They're going to continue to be troubled. So I take his point. I think he's right. I believe we will have vaccines because I like to smile. I want to hug my mommy.
Yeah, I would concur that this the coming marketplace of experimentation that has expanded is going to address what has long been the consternation of a lot of parents and grandparents who wanted more and better for their kids, but are locked into kind of a one-size-fits-all system. So the marketplace of experimentation is going to yield a lot of customization and flexibility that will better serve students.
Yeah, agreed. Well, that's the end of our questions. Debbie, would you like to have some closing comments, and then we'll move over to Jim and Tracy?
Absolutely. We're just at WGU excited to partner with folks like those on the call and other institutions to reinvent higher ed. It's going to be fantastic.
Thanks, Debbie. Jim, final thought.
Yeah, final thought is I think the solutions lie obviously in the digital world, absolutely, but I do think we should have our eyes really peeled on digital plus, and that are hybrid settings, reutilization of campuses, and all that stuff's going to come out of the privates. You don't expect it out of the publics.
Fair enough. Tracy, final thoughts to tie everything together?
Well, this gives me a lot of hope because what we're seeing play out is the beginning of a transformation, going from a transformation of an enormous top-down system that we wouldn't have imagined. It took a pandemic to dislodge it. Become more of a true bottom-up growing thing where students realize they're not dependent on bricks and mortar of a college campus to get an education. The world is bottom-up, and that's what makes markets so wonderful, as opposed to the top-down command control system of one-size-fits-all. I think the best thing this network can do is look at some of the examples of Western governors and the things that Jim and Pioneer Institute are doing to seize the opportunity to introduce flexible, realistic reforms that help as many Americans as possible. This is what the network was built to do, to be agile and respond to the most pressing needs. So I'm grateful for the work that our speakers have done and sharing their knowledge. And it's something we can amplify and share with the rest of the network.
Thanks, Tracy. And Debbie and Jim, I second that. I'm so grateful for your leadership on this issue. I live in Columbia, South Carolina, a college football town. Go Gamecocks. And everybody's hedging all their bets on, being able to play football. If that football game's canceled, there will be furloughs and this whole community will crumble. So it's an odd time, and I'm really happy to know that your leadership's out there and you guys are paving the way. So thank you. Now, you guys, viewers, we're supposed to be switching to every other week, yet August, there's been so much excitement. We've been doing shows every week. So we've got one more for you in August. Join us next Wednesday, August 29th. We're not talking about young people. We're going to take a little pause from that. We are going to dig into the integrity of US elections. It will be a very fun episode. I hope you guys will be there Wednesday. See you there. Thanks for all you do. Have a great day.
Care.